one, I think, first of all, we should proceed this from the fact that we are 28 to 30 years in this democracy. And so it's long enough a time to reflect, review, and see whether what parties do in elections and in other fields actually consolidate our democracy. Where there are weaknesses, you address them. And the methods of addressing weaknesses will vary. When you take the long-term view, you'll find out that recurring problems probably need some major policy reform. And those that have been more administrative, can be held, done the way they've been doing it. When you look at the reforms you're proposing, they are all not just administrative things, because I think we've all admit that over the 30 years, close to 30 years, we've seen major weaknesses in our multi-party democracy. And the idea that two parties have emerged, very powerful, we call them duopolies by their behavior and so on, also exposes the fact that perhaps the institutions of state that ought to look at all this were not all established at the time. And therefore, if now it has become a matter, that is why the appropriate forum issue has arisen. I mean, if you, who convenes parties to meetings? IPAC initially was an administrative mechanism invented by the EC and controlled by the EC, frankly. That's why there's no law backing it. Informal conversations that now became more or less regularized, but still there was no need to set up a law and so on. But now you have a situation where you see clearly that some issues, the EC says, go to IPAC, and one of the parties say, well, IPAC really, these issues look bigger than IPAC. We probably have to look at it differently. And then you have others saying, no, one other party saying, no, it must go to IPAC. So the question of the aged, politics, party politics, the issues arising are not like those of 1992 or 1993 or 1995 when IPAC started. But IPAC has been used effectively to drive political reforms. These are bigger issues. Issues of regulation cannot be a matter for IPAC. And by the way, it is not even right that matters affecting multi-party politics should only be discussed by the two parties or reduced to electoral issues. There are bigger issues that must be. I was saying that first look at the landscape of parties, and you would find that we have only these two parties all the time. It's a multi-party democracy, a constitutional multi-party democracy. But as a matter of fact, you only have two parties. None of the parties, since 2012, smaller parties have been able to enter parliament. And then when you want to understand why, you begin to see that a lot has to also do, not just with electoral rules, but even the design of the executive arm of government and how it excludes parties, including the major opposition party. So if we want to look at the bigger issues they're raising, I think the forum issue, the right forum to discuss, has come up, but here we see a vacuum. Where should it go? I think in the interim, for IDEC, as far back as 2014, we saw this problem and we said there might be the need to create a multi-party democracy commission that must have two tasks. The things that are beyond IPAC, the consultations, the administrative conversations, and they agreeing in a gentlemanly way to implement decisions arrive at IPAC. It's not for the EC to enforce everything. They themselves will go and implement it within their parties and come back to report to IPAC. We call that is a corporatist mechanism. You don't need the law to back it, frankly. You can operate within the IPAC framework. However, if it goes beyond that and you're looking at parties vanishing, disappearing, and only two parties with a certain behavior that is even threatening the stability of the whole thing, resort to violence and vigilantes, armed vigilantes. In the economy, when any organization begins behaving in a way that is considered not to be in the public interest or in the interest of the market, the state acts. And there are various institutions. I'm just drawing this analogy. You have the Bank of Ghana dealing with the banks, you have the Securities and Exchange Commission dealing with others, and so on and so forth. Look at our democracy, there's nothing. You only have EC and IPAC. And the issues emerging are bigger than IPAC, I must say. So in the interim, you would have thought that probably the parties in acting, looking at themselves, the two parties, will probably engage in some bilateral conversation. But if you look at the history of the two parties, they don't easily talk to a conclusion, okay? Or move towards a conclusion which is in the national interest. Most often, the conversation breaks down. There's a walkout. It started in Parliament. They will walk out. They stay in dialogue, sustaining dialogue, because there's always debate. The deliberative content is not there. And there is no institution of state that can convene them, has the power to convene them and take them through a process of conversation. That says the national interest requires it, the interest of democracy. We are not just running elections. We're also doing development. We want peace. We want stability.
So what am I hearing you say the EC should do in this circumstance?
I think that the EC is in some difficult situation. If you were to ask me, I think a facilitated conversation between the two major parties who stand on the proposals is crucial, will be important before they go to the EC. You see, the IPAC cannot handle all the issues. And the IPAC, over time, since 2012, and I heard, oh my goodness, the first speaker, speaking about it. Since 2012, or even before 2012, if you observe IPAC from about 2004 or 2008, it became difficult for Dr. Farijan, then chairman of the commission, to get through some of the even reforms he wanted to undertake through the EC. It was extremely difficult. It aggravated by 2012. The only thing they agreed on easily was the IPAC, the biometric voters register. And it was very difficult for him. Then we saw how the violence and the courts